Right. Hi, everyone. I'm Dave Damato. I'm the Chief Security Officer at Gemini, the world's most trusted cryptocurrency exchange and custodian. And today I wanted to share some of the work that we've done around Fido2 for the past few years. HODL is a term you may have heard about before. It's one of those terms that comes up in cryptocurrency, and it has its origins in a 2013 Bitcoin forum post in which a user mistyped "I am holding" as "I am holding." So I thought it'd be a good way to kick off the presentation and introduce everyone to a core term in crypto and sort of highlight my passion for holding Fido2 as well. So before we begin, I wanted to share a bit about me and what it is we're doing here at Gemini. I personally spent the last 20 years or so in security. I was in the defense industry for a while. I worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where I performed penetration tests and incident response work. I was an early member of the leadership team at Mandiant, where I helped expand the consulting practice and responded to about 100 or so incidents. And I was the first hire at Tanium, where I helped to build a mature cybersecurity program. So much of my career has been really focused on preventing and responding to incidents, and strong two-factor authentication is at the core preventing most of those attacks. It's also why I'm so very enthusiastic about Fido2. At Gemini, I'm specifically focused on protecting our customers and their crypto. For those of you who don't know, Gemini was founded by Cameron and Tyler Winklevoss, and they were some of the earliest and largest investors in Bitcoin. Early on, they realized that they needed a secure place to store their crypto, and so they created one in Gemini. We're also very focused on compliance. We believe that in order to ensure broader adoption of crypto, we need to partner with our regulators. And we're regulated by the New York Department of Financial Services. We're also the first SOC 2 Type 2 cryptocurrency exchange and custodian. And we also have a slew of other regulations and certifications. You can find those all on our website under the security page. We also have an amazing security team that is very passionate about secure authentication. That includes Nick Steele, who sits on the W3C for WebAuthn, and Rich Smith, formerly head of Duo Labs. And that passion extends into our products. And we're currently the only exchange to support Fido2 for both web and our mobile app. And for that reason, we thought it would be very helpful to share our journey with Fido2. So let's dive into our agenda. There are really three things I wanted to speak to you about today. First is, what makes crypto different? Why is Fido2 so important to crypto? The second is, how are we using Fido2 to provide our users with a better, more secure experience? What did we learn over the past 2 years, supporting our customers and encouraging them to adopt more secure Fido2 authenticators? Finally, I'll leave you with some key takeaways. These should be helpful in your own journey and hopefully towards supporting Fido2 for your own customers. So crypto is different than traditional finance. In many ways, it's more secure, but it also requires a different approach to security, especially when it comes to account takeovers or ATOs. ATOs come in many shapes and sizes, but for us specifically, we're concerned about preventing criminals from trading or withdrawing crypto as a result of an account takeover. So there are a few reasons why ATOs within crypto are different than at traditional financial institutions. So let's take a quick look at that. So I'm going to speak very generally about cryptocurrency. There are many different types of cryptocurrencies, and most will exhibit these three properties to varying extents, but not all. The first is trustless. Users of cryptocurrency don't actually need to know or trust each other for the system to work as expected. The second is decentralized. There's no centralized entity. For example, there's no one company that owns a cryptocurrency. And immutability. Transactions are generally final. So in crypto, once you make a transaction, it's generally finalized within minutes, not hours. There's also no centralized entities. So unlike a bank transfer, there's no way to cancel a transaction and get your money back a day or two later. There's also no company to call. On the one hand, this is great, quick and final transfers, but it's also a challenge for us, especially when considering account takeovers. There's no room for error. We have to be 100% effective in preventing ATOs. So let's talk about some of the common types of ATOs and how we can mitigate risk simply and easily with varying forms of two-factor authentication. So first, let's talk about a simple ATO. The most simple form of an ATO is one in which the criminal is able to obtain credentials and then simply turn around and use them. This commonly follows a few different steps. So first, the attacker will harvest credentials. This is usually going to be from some sort of malware or botnet that exists that may be harvesting credentials on user systems, or even more commonly, or even more simple, would be just relying on previous breaches where there's a dump of email addresses and passwords from another service. Since most people share credentials across different services, it's pretty easy to take them from one breach and reuse them. The second is they'll test those credentials for specific services. We call this credential stuffing. They'll simply try and log on to different services with an email and a password and see what works. And then they'll finally take those credentials and sell them or use them to actually compromise their target users. Many companies these days actually require some form of verification when logging in from a new device, which makes sense. This is usually done via email, but due to the fact that people reuse passwords across different services, email often has the same password, so it's not always an effective control. So quickly reviewing, TLDR, this is the most common form of an ATO. Most users reuse passwords, so email isn't a very difficult hurdle. And this is the least expensive attack with the lowest bar to entry. Anyone is really capable of performing such an attack. Next, we look at SIM swaps and a little bit more complicated account takeover. So given how easy a simple ATO is, many companies have or are moving to more secure SMS 2FA. When SMS two-factor is required, an attacker will need to perform a SIM swap. SIM swapping occurs when an attacker socially engineers your carrier into switching your number to the SIM card that they control, so actually their phone. This is commonly done via some sort of phone support scam where they call your carrier, or actually in the store with fake credentials, or by even bribing a carrier's employee. So as an organization that requires at a minimum SMS 2FA here at Gemini, I can tell you that SIM swaps do occur, but they represent a much more costly attack than a simple ATO. So let's just review a common SIM swap attack. An attacker will perform a SIM swap attack by calling your carrier and socially engineering them into switching to their number. If the attacker already has a user's credentials, then they can simply intercept the two-factor authentication code on their phone and log into the service. If they don't have the credentials, they'll simply take over the user's email via SMS recovery. What many people don't realize is that popular email providers use SMS codes for account recovery. With access to email, they can then simply reset the target's credentials. With credentials and access to your SMS code, they can then access your account. So, comparatively speaking, TLDR, this is significantly harder than compromising just your username and password, but it's not insurmountable for most organized criminals. Due to SIM swapping, some services now support OTP, or time-based one-time passwords, TOTP or OTP. Although I'm really unaware of any services that require it, it's something that more and more organizations are supporting. TOTP is better than SMS 2FA, but it does introduce a lot of friction. This includes initial setup, use, and sort of challenges when you have to transfer your TOTP to a new device after losing an existing device or upgrading to a new device, for example. So what does an attack against OTP look like? First, in many cases, people store their backup codes in email or online storage. So a SIM swap may be able to successfully defeat TOTP. I see this happen frequently within the crypto community. People take pictures of their backup codes, which end up on Google Drive, or in Photos, or in Dropbox, or somewhere else that's accessible. But the majority of time, social engineering is required to defeat TOTP. In this case, the attacker has the credentials most likely, and they just need the second factor. And so they'll ask for the OTP code, or for a user to authorize a new device or a TOTP authenticator. Most common scam is one of the support scams that you hear about most often, where an attacker just calls a user claiming to be from the service they're supporting and solicits a two-factor authentication code. The end result is the same: compromise a two-factor code. So TLDR, TOTP is more secure than SMS because it should effectively be somewhat offline in terms of backup codes are physically printed out and stored securely. That users really shouldn't be giving up their code. But in reality, many users actually store their backup codes online, and they also reveal their codes when social engineering. And honestly, TOTP can introduce a lot of friction and increase support costs. So how do we actually prevent account takeovers when an attacker can either SIM swap a user or socially engineer a user to defeat SMS and TOTP 2FA. Easy. That's where Fido 2 comes in. So 2 years ago at Gemini, we wanted to offer our customers the highest level of security possible. And we did this by starting to support Fido 2. In the previous slides, we discussed the challenge of protecting two-factor authentication codes. Fido 2 is designed to overcome these challenges and dramatically increase the cost for an attacker. With Fido 2, there is no second-factor code. There's no password that can be shared by our customers. And that's why Fido 2 is phishing resistant. So if we go through all the different technologies, there's no SMS code to capture or share. There's no TOTP code to share. There's no backup codes. And it's actually a much more user-friendly experience. At worst, I simply enter my username and password and then push a button. Additionally, Fido 2 mitigates replay attacks, which can occur when an attacker attempts a person in the middle attack against a customer. Finally, the benefit to me as a company is that I don't actually have to store or manage credentials, or I don't have to worry about other breaches where credentials have been stolen. So even if company A is compromised and you reuse credentials at company B, the risk of an account takeover at company B is mitigated because there's no credentials from Fido 2 that are actually stored. That second factor has nothing to do with that service, even though the passwords may be compromised. For these reasons, in early 2019, Gemini was the first exchange to launch support for Fido 2. That included a bunch of different authenticators, both platform and cross-platform. Some of those were Touch ID, Windows Hello, USB, NFC, Bluetooth, and Lightning as well. So our implementation actually required 2 keys, primary or backup key. We're not really specifying which one is which, but we did this to facilitate sort of the best possible experience. So keep in mind that if a user loses their Fido 2 authenticator, the bar for account recovery is extremely high. For us in particular, that actually involves a video chat, which is pretty costly. So we wanted to avoid the chances that a recovery was required and to minimize the impact on our own support organizations and users. We also became the first exchange to support Fido 2 on our mobile app. This ensured that we actually provided the same experience and support for all our users, regardless of their second factor solution. This is incredibly important as many implementations break functionality in order to support Fido 2. And when you do that, understandably, this typically results in a very poor adoption by your users. We did run into some issues, especially on mobile with Fido 2. So we discovered that not all SDKs are created equal, and we ran into some compatibility issues for certain NFC devices and iPhones. Not really Fido 2's shortcomings, more of different vendors that are writing libraries, also different hardware manufacturers. We also ran into some issues using the Ubico SDK for iOS, specifically with supporting different NFC devices. So the other thing you'll need to do is you'll need to decide if you want to support enrollment on both web and mobile. And that'll be dependent on your product and your users and sort of the split between web versus mobile. So next, let's talk a bit about a few numbers that demonstrate the benefits of Fido 2 that we've seen over the last year or so. So some of the stats from the Fido 2 usage today. Today we have approximately 5% of our users that rely on Fido 2. And most people that I speak with feel that that number is pretty small, but I actually think we're doing pretty well considering the minimal investment that we've made and the fact that it's a relatively new technology that isn't really ubiquitous. I think we all have to keep in mind that many of our users actually bought a Fido 2 Authenticate. So think about that. A customer actually paid money for security. That doesn't really happen often. So that's why I'm pretty confident that this number will continue to improve over time, especially as Fido 2 authenticators are part of the devices and better understood. From a business perspective, there were a few benefits that we noticed. So first, we've never actually had a user compromised that was a result or associated with Fido 2. So that's a tremendous cost savings to us. It limits the impact on customer support and trust and safety, and potentially regulatory or legal challenges that we might encounter. And as you'd expect, customers with more crypto are more concerned about security. And so we actually saw new and existing customers with higher notional balances more quickly adopt use of Fido 2. So there's actually a competitive advantage here where customers can switch from one exchange to our platform to get improved security and a better cross-platform experience with the support of both web and mobile. When we started offering support for FIDO2 authenticators back in 2019, it was used by less than 1% of our customers, considerably less than 1%. So how did we actually improve adoption closer to 5%? The first and easiest thing we did was we sent some emails to our customers. Not surprisingly, that didn't work too well. Most people ignore marketing emails, but it did increase our adoption a bit. We then extended to mobile, which happened in 2020. And ensuring that experience was the same across web and mobile was really, I think, saw a big increase in adoption. So we immediately jumped above 1% with that change. So I'd assume that's a pretty important thing. So if you're going to roll out FIDO2, you really should have a similar platform experience between web and mobile. Not surprisingly, the most effective method for driving adoption was marketing spend. So we created some blogs, we engaged influencers on Twitter, and we partnered with Yubico to provide some promotional pricing and giveaways for authenticators. This had the most dramatic impact. It brought us to the current levels where we are today. So that was, unsurprisingly, marketing dollars tend to get more users. We also tried gifting. We sent 50 customers FIDO2 authenticators that supported NFC, USB Type A and C connectors. And we also included some swag and detailed instructions with links to videos to help people sort of onboard. And surprisingly, it was a big failure. Only 2 of the users that we had sent the FIDO2 authenticators to were actually using them or had enrolled them a month later. So we're going to plan the follow-up with those users and figure out what went wrong. But this is a good example of how we've yet to hit the sort of tipping point for FIDO2. We need more awareness, greater ubiquity of platform authenticators before I think we see better adoption. And I'm sure I'll learn something new about the process and the instructions we send out when we talk to some of these customers. Next, we're also going to plan to try some different methods to incentivize users to adopt FIDO2 authenticators as well. And one of those is to provide them with an easier user experience, so whether that's actually passwordless or simply less touch points for different authorization actions. Finding a way to make authentication easier and more streamlined by using a lower risk authenticator like FIDO2 would be one of our next steps to try. So we're pretty excited about continuing to experiment with FIDO2 adoption, and I hope that some of these efforts are going to help in driving standardization around future deployments elsewhere. So the last year has taught us a lot about FIDO2 use in an organization like Gemini, and so just wanted to take a look at maybe some of the key takeaways before we wrap up. So first, I want to make sure everyone realizes that SMS is good. SMS two-factor is good. Everyone should start there. It's low friction. It eliminates a lot of basic problems. Please, at a minimum, support this. You can't really just skip this step and jump right to FIDO2. TOTP is better than SMS, right? But it's still vulnerable to phishing and introduces a lot of friction. And you have to find a code. You have to remember to migrate before trading in phones. And there's still some issues with how people back up their codes as well. FIDO2, I would say, significantly raises the cost for attackers. And it's so expensive that there really aren't many great examples of exploitation, at least that I'm aware of. Some lessons learned from the SDKs. SDK support will vary by vendor. Based on our experience, mobile support was probably the biggest unknown, and NFC support varies by some of those third-party libraries that we took a look at. Generally, though, the browser compatibility issue that maybe was the biggest issue early on was kind of a thing of the past as we started to look at FIDO2 more recently. Adoption is also very difficult. So far, marketing has worked the best, like I said. But my thought on this is that we really haven't hit that tipping point. Not everyone has 2 authenticators. Most people aren't going to pay for them. And so until they're ubiquitous and free, I'm certain adoption will continue to remain limited to SMS and OTP. And finally, account recovery. This is probably the most important takeaway. Account recovery has to be as strong as the authentication that you're using. So I'll give you a good example. Pick a bank of your choice that you may be using with OTP, TOTP. Call them, ask them to reset your 2-factor authentication code. and they'll likely ask you some basic personal questions or ask you for an SMS code that they've sent you. So they'll use a less secure form of authentication for verification. So if you're going to support something like FIDO2, you're going to have to develop a much stronger form of verification for your users when they call in for support issues, especially things like changing your second factor when they've sort of lost their second factor solution. So great. So thanks so much for taking the time to listen to me talk about our experience with FIDO2, and I'm looking forward to answering questions during our panel discussion later.